Just before we get into the meat of this episode, I do want to say for those who are perhaps new to Unsung Heroes that if you enjoy episodes in particular from this series, you can jump over via the link below to the Discord chat for this channel and actually vote on all of your favourite cars that we've ever featured for the 100th episode of this series, because in that episode I'm going to be counting down the top 10 community favourites from the series so far. So be sure to jump over and do that, maybe for this episode, maybe for some previous ones. Now, this particular vehicle is a car that chances are many of you didn't even know existed. A Porsche Indycar. What an interesting concept. And there are actually multiple teams and multiple specific cars that you probably would never think would enter Indy. Now, I am not a huge Indy fan in general, but I am very specifically a fan of certain specialised Indy cars throughout the years. We've even talked about some in this series. We've had some that tried to use steam, we've had some that tried to use diesel, and of course, one of the most famous oddball ones is the cars that try to use turbines. Now, this one isn't quite that radical in a traditional sense, and it's also a lot newer than many of the other Indy cars that we've talked about. But of course, the brand which it comes from, Porsche, well, they're no one to be trifled with. When they enter a race, they enter to win, and more often than not, they do just that. Now, this era that they entered the Indy in was a very unfortunate one for them, as it would turn out, and of course this car is an unsung hero, so it can't have all gone according to plan. But at the time, two separate large bodies of people, governing bodies in a sense you could say, were actually vying for power over the Indy 500. And these two particular groups were the USAC and CART. And these two were fiercely opposed to each other. Now, a number of notable drivers were on the side of CART, and a number of advantages were on the side of the USAC. Now, when Porsche wanted to enter in 1980, they decided to work with a company who they'd worked with before in a number of races not involved in Indy, more GT-style stuff, called Interscope. And what Porsche chose to actually do for this IndyCar, I think, was pretty clever. Instead of building a ground-up creation, which wouldn't have been too surprising from a company of the caliber of Porsche, they decided to work with the aforementioned Interscope to use more of an existing chassis style and then modify it to their own style on top of that. And that included the engine. Now, this car had an engine unlike anything else on the grid at the time. The vast majority, if not all, because I haven't double-checked, of the cars on the grid, certainly the most competitive ones, were using Cosworth engines. And one of the great things about these Cosworth engines at the time is they were actually used as part of the monocoque chassis. So parts were bolted to the engine itself because it could cope with that. It was designed to. Porsche's flat six engine, on the other hand, was not designed for that. So one of the things that had to be done was the car actually had to have a kind of a cradle frame design to put the engine into, instead of being part of a traditional monocoque, which initially could sound like a disadvantage. But here's one of the interesting things. Porsche not only decided to use the engine from, for instance, their 935s in this new application, which was already a proven engine, it had won many races, but what they decided to do as well was bring over a driver, a Hawaiian driver by the name of Danny Ongase, who not only had driven those 935s and was an experienced oval racer himself, but he had won the 24 Hours of Daytona in '79 with a Porsche 935, which the engine came from. Now, of course, the engine wasn't exactly the same in this car. In fact, it was an even higher spec version. And in order to not run into some potential issues that certain Porsche and classic Volkswagen flat engines could run into, to do with cooling for instance, the car did have additional cooling as well, from of course oil but water in addition to that. So what they actually did was very interesting, because one of the rules at the time actually allowed for not quite a loophole, but pretty close to it, wherein that cars that ran a stock block, as it were allowed to have a higher boost on the turbo and produce more power. So Porsche did that, because that's exactly what the 935 engine that they were using in this Indy car allowed them to do. Now, they took the car to a private test track, which was very similar to the actual Indy oval. Similar size, similar style, so that if the car dominated this test track and performed well there, it was almost a dead cert that it would be good at Indy. And unsurprisingly for Porsche, it was very good on this test track. In fact, on the first day of testing, it broke the existing all-time lap record on the test track, let alone at Indy. Now, unfortunately for Porsche, and you'd kind of think that they'd know this, there were spies on this test day who not only were going to report back to other teams, but also to the governing bodies involved. And a certain AJ Foyt, who was a name who will be, of course, pretty well known to any Indy fan of the time, didn't like this, surprise, surprise, because it would have almost certainly meant that his Cosworth-powered machine would have not won. And that's not a great feeling to have before you even enter the race. So, why does that matter? Well, as I mentioned earlier, a number of the top drivers were on the side of the CART. AJ Foyt, on the other hand, sided with the USAC, and they could not afford to lose a driver of his caliber because of this new Porsche team entering the race. As cool as that would be, they were over the moon about Porsche wanting to compete, but not at the risk of losing a more political position for the sake of an engineering advantage and, of course, more eyes on the sport, if you will, because of Porsche being there, eyes which wouldn't usually be there. Think, for instance, if Bugatti entered NASCAR, as an example, it would certainly be a hot-button topic. Now, what the USAC tried to do after AJ Foyt complained about this car and the pressure started to be piled on was they actually went to Porsche and tried to offer them an alternative. They said to Porsche, could you provide us with engines for Indy? Porsche didn't really get the idea, apparently, of what this offer really meant, and they flatly refused it, apparently rather bluntly, and that rubbed the USAC the wrong way. And so they immediately did what Foyt wanted and banned that car's amount of boost, which immediately dropped the car from a dominating over 800 horsepower output to about 630, which almost guaranteed it would not score better in the race than middle of the grid. And, of course, Porsche being Porsche, that was not an option. So they responded with a single-page resignation from the event, and although they did actually come back later on, twice in fact, in 1987 and 1990, Porsche never fully got the kind of grasp into Indy that they did in many other events. Now, speaking of those two other entries that they did, they entered, as I said, in 1990, and that was actually the last time they entered. But at that time, the CART outlawed the carbon fiber chassis that they were originally trying to run with. They had to make some changes, and ultimately the car wasn't a success. The best result it had was 5th place. In 1987, though, interestingly, they ran a car by the name of the 2708, which is probably the most well-known of the three, with a green and white livery, and that one actually did have some success in the 1987 season, with some victories and some podiums. But ultimately, you could tell that Porsche's heart just wasn't really in the Indy in the same way that they are in other events around the world, and they certainly didn't have the same level of success that they did elsewhere. But at this point, you could well be thinking, well, why are any of these cars, least of all the one that I'm talking about primarily, which is the original that of course never even raced, why is it an unsung hero? Is it just because it's fast? Well, partially yes. It would have been, I think, very cool for a team who had never entered the sport before to immediately have such a dominant car that they destroyed the 1980 season, and I think that would have been cool. However, the real reason why that original car was an unsung hero is because of that engine, because although it didn't bring that car success, it was used in the 956 and the 962, albeit, of course, in different states of tune. So although this car didn't achieve what Porsche wanted, the engine technology, the development put into it, and the kind of performance that it resulted in, you could definitely say had a pretty direct impact into Porsche's choice of moving forward with motorsport into the Group C era, or at least the 956 and 962 era of the Group C era, and look at the success which they had. They are legendary. I do find it curious, though, that even with the 1987 car's reasonable success on a number of events, Porsche fans still don't talk about these, like, at all. Even Porsche superfans, I've never heard speak about Porsche's Indy efforts, even with the success of the 2708, which is odd to me. It's almost as if even with those race victories, Porsche themselves don't even really care that much, and I find that interesting. Ultimately, though, it's a very interesting IndyCar story which, like so many racing teams and brilliant vehicles, was stunted by the behind-the-scenes politics and the nuances of this person versus that person getting offended and all that kind of stuff. It's still an interesting car, an interesting series of cars, in fact. So, of course, if you enjoyed this episode and like the car in question, jump over, as I said, to the Discord chat and vote on it, or vote for previous ones that you've enjoyed as well. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.